Do you think God brings people back together for a reason? Jessica Caban asked quietly. Bruno Mars stopped moving. The noise inside the luxury restaurant seemed to disappear for a moment. Across the room, a 7-year-old girl had just asked a simple question about God, unaware that her words would somehow reach two people who had spent years avoiding each other. Bruno looked at Jessica. Jessica looked down, then back at him. Neither of them smiled. They had not spoken in a long time. They had not sat across from each other like this since their relationship was said to have ended. Yet somehow, on this night, in a restaurant filled with people who had no idea what was happening, they were standing only a few feet apart. Bruno slowly lowered his glass. His expression changed. Jessica noticed it immediately. "Why are you asking me that?" Bruno whispered. Jessica took a breath. "Because I think I already know the answer." For several seconds, neither spoke. The little girl's question had opened a door neither of them wanted to touch. Bruno looked toward Jessica again, and this time, his eyes were wet. "Jessica," he said softly. She shook her head. "Don't say it unless you mean it." Bruno stepped closer. The room remained strangely quiet around them. Then Jessica revealed something she had never told Bruno after they stopped communicating. Bruno's face changed instantly. He looked stunned. And when Jessica finally said the one sentence she had carried with her for years, Bruno could no longer hold back his tears. The restaurant was still watching Bruno Mars and Jessica Caban when the silence became impossible to ignore. Bruno stood beside the table, one hand resting against the back of a chair, while Jessica remained across from him. The soft music continued, but neither of them seemed to hear it. A few seconds earlier, they had been talking about a 7-year-old girl's innocent question about God. Now, somehow, that question had brought years of distance into the room. Jessica looked at Bruno carefully. She could see the hesitation in his face. He wanted to say something, but he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Bruno swallowed. "I never stopped." Jessica looked away. Her eyes became wet, but she refused to let the tears fall. For years, she had wondered whether Bruno had moved on emotionally. She had heard his songs. She had seen the applause, the tours, the interviews, the endless attention. From a distance, his life appeared to keep moving forward. But standing in front of him now, she saw something different. He looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. And Bruno saw the same thing in Jessica. She was stronger than he remembered, but there was something behind her eyes that had never fully healed. Then, the little girl looked toward them again. "Mom said people meet for a reason," she said. Jessica smiled faintly. Bruno didn't. He was staring at Jessica. That sentence had hit something inside him. Jessica noticed. "That's what scares me," she whispered. Bruno stepped closer. "Why?" "Because if we met for a reason," Jessica paused, "maybe we were never supposed to forget each other." Bruno lowered his head. For the first time that night, he stopped trying to protect himself. "I didn't forget you." Jessica's breathing changed. Neither of them moved. Then Bruno reached into his jacket and pulled out something small. Jessica's eyes immediately widened. It was an old photograph. One she thought Bruno had thrown away years ago. She stared at it without speaking. Bruno held it between them. "I kept this," he said. Jessica looked at him. "Why?" Bruno's voice became almost a whisper. "Because I couldn't let myself believe that everything we had meant nothing." Jessica finally let one tear fall. But what Bruno didn't know was that Jessica had kept something too. And when she reached into her purse, Bruno's expression completely changed. The photograph remained between them, but Jessica still had not shown Bruno what was inside her purse. She held it tightly for a moment, almost as if she were deciding whether to protect the past or finally face it. Then she placed a small envelope on the table. Bruno looked at it. "What's that?" Jessica took a slow breath. "Something I never knew how to give you." Bruno didn't touch it. He looked at Jessica instead. She nodded. "Open it." Inside was a handwritten note. The paper was old. The edges were slightly worn. Bruno recognized Jessica's handwriting immediately. He read the first line. Then he stopped. Jessica watched his face change. Years earlier, before the distance between them became permanent, they had talked about a simple dream. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about another award or another sold-out arena. They wanted a place where neither of them had to perform. A quiet home. A normal morning. Coffee at the same table. Music playing in the background. No cameras. No schedules. No strangers asking questions. Just Bruno and Jessica. They had even joked about what they would call the little room where Bruno could write music. Jessica had wanted it filled with books and plants. Bruno wanted a piano near the window. It sounded ordinary. That was exactly why it mattered. But life became louder. Bruno's career grew. His schedule became impossible. Jessica had her own dreams and responsibilities. Their private world slowly became harder to protect. Eventually, conversations became shorter. Then less frequent. Then almost non-existent. Neither of them could point to one moment when everything ended. That was the painful part. There had been no dramatic goodbye. Just silence. And silence became a habit. Bruno continued reading. The note was about their old dream. But Jessica had added something years later. "I never stopped wanting that life," Bruno read quietly. He looked up. Jessica's eyes were fixed on him. "You kept this?" he asked. "No." Bruno looked confused. "I wrote another one." Jessica reached into the envelope and pulled out a second piece of paper. "This one is from last year." Bruno stared at it. "Why did you write it?" Jessica hesitated. "Because I realized something." "What?" She looked directly into his eyes. "I wasn't waiting for you to come back." Bruno's face tightened. "I was waiting to know whether you still wanted the same dream." The words hit him harder than anything else that night. For years, Bruno had assumed the door between them was closed. Jessica had assumed he had stopped caring. Both had been wrong. Bruno looked at the old photograph again. Then at the two notes. Then at Jessica. "What if I still do?" he asked. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She smiled through them. "Then we have a problem." Bruno almost laughed. "What problem?" Jessica looked toward the window. "Because I still do too." For the first time that night, they both smiled. But neither of them knew that their shared dream was about to be tested by a decision neither had expected to make. For a few seconds, the restaurant felt almost peaceful again. Bruno and Jessica were still looking at each other when the music in the room suddenly changed. The soft piano track stopped. A live musician near the far side of the restaurant began playing a familiar melody instead. Bruno recognized it immediately. So did Jessica. Neither of them spoke. The psalm was one they had once listened to together during one of the hardest periods of their relationship. Back then, Bruno had been exhausted from constant work. Jessica had been trying to understand why the man she loved could be surrounded by thousands of people and still feel completely alone. That night had ended with them sitting silently beside each other. No arguments. No explanations. Just two people trying to stay close. Now, years later, the same melody filled the room. Jessica slowly looked down. Bruno noticed. "You remember?" he asked. She nodded. "Everything." The camera-like attention of the room seemed to shift toward them. A few people had begun noticing that something emotional was happening. Bruno didn't care. For once, he wasn't thinking about being watched. He was thinking about Jessica. Then his phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen. His expression changed. Jessica immediately noticed. "What is it?" Bruno didn't answer. He turned the screen toward her. It was a message from someone connected to his professional team. A major opportunity had suddenly changed his schedule. A long international commitment. Months away. The kind of commitment that had once created the distance between them. Jessica read the message. Her smile disappeared. "So that's it," she said quietly. Bruno frowned. "What?" "You finally remember what we wanted, and now you're leaving again." Bruno's face tightened. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He hesitated. That hesitation hurt her more than the message. Jessica slowly stepped back. "You don't have to explain." "Jessica, wait." She shook her head. "No, I've heard that before." The music continued. The restaurant became quieter. Bruno took one step toward her. "I don't want to lose you again." Jessica looked at him, fighting back tears. "Then don't make me compete with your life." Bruno stopped. Those words stayed between them. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't asking him to give up his career. She was asking whether there was still room for her inside the life he had built. Bruno looked at the old photograph on the table. Then at the note Jessica had written. Then back at her. His breathing slowed. "I thought success meant having everything," he said. Jessica whispered. "And now?" Bruno's eyes filled with tears. "Now I know what I was missing." Jessica didn't answer. But something in her expression softened. Then, without warning, the little girl who had asked the question about God walked past their table again. She stopped. Looked at Bruno. Then looked at Jessica. And asked the one question neither of them was prepared to hear. "Are you two going to be together again?" Jessica froze. Bruno looked at her. The entire moment suddenly felt bigger than either of them. And this time, Bruno didn't look away. The question hung in the air. "Are you two going to be together again?" Bruno looked at Jessica, but this time he didn't rush to answer. His eyes dropped for a moment. He took a slow breath, then looked back at her. Jessica could see the conflict on his face. She knew that look. It was the same look he had when he was trying to make a difficult decision without hurting someone. Bruno finally smiled at the girl. "I don't know," he said gently. Jessica looked down. The answer was honest. But it still hurt. The little girl nodded and walked back toward her family. Bruno turned toward Jessica. I don't want to promise something I can't control. Jessica nodded. That's the first honest thing you've said tonight. He gave a small, almost nervous laugh. I deserve that. For the first time, Jessica smiled. But the tension didn't disappear. Bruno looked at the message on his phone again. Months away. Another demanding schedule. Another test. He could have told Jessica what she wanted to hear. He could have promised that everything would be different. But he knew better. They had already made promises they couldn't keep. This time, Bruno wanted something different. He wanted a decision based on reality. I can't promise I'll always be here, he said. Jessica looked at him. But I can promise I won't disappear. Her expression changed. That sentence mattered. Because disappearing had been what hurt her most. Not the distance. Not the career. Not even the breakup. The silence. The unanswered messages. The feeling that the person who once knew everything about her had suddenly become a stranger. Jessica took a slow breath. Then I need something from you. Anything. Don't ask me to trust you overnight. Bruno nodded. I won't. And don't tell me everything will be perfect. I won't. Jessica looked directly into his eyes. Then what are you asking for? Bruno paused. One more conversation. Jessica almost smiled. We've been talking all night. I mean tomorrow. She looked surprised. Tomorrow? Same place. Jessica looked toward the window. She could feel the old fear returning. What if he changed his mind? What if the schedule became more important? What if this was only nostalgia? Then she remembered the photograph. The note. The way Bruno had looked at her. And she realized something. For the first time in years, Bruno wasn't asking her to return to the past. He was asking whether they could build something new. Jessica nodded slowly. Tomorrow. Bruno smiled. Tomorrow. Neither of them knew what would happen after that. But for the first time, neither of them walked away. The next evening, Bruno arrived first. He sat at the same table, without a manager, without an entourage, without anyone from his team. Just Bruno, a cup of coffee, and the old photograph resting beside his hand. For nearly 20 minutes, he kept looking toward the entrance. Then Jessica walked in. She wasn't dressed for cameras. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to make the moment bigger than it was. She simply saw Bruno and smiled. Bruno stood. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Jessica walked toward him. Hi. Hi. Two simple words. But both knew how much those words carried. Jessica sat down. Bruno pushed the photograph toward her. I brought this back. Jessica looked at it. You kept it for years. I know. She touched the edge of the photograph with her fingertips. You really thought we'd come back here? Bruno shook his head. No. I just couldn't throw it away. Jessica looked up. That was when Bruno finally said what he had been afraid to say. I was angry with you. Jessica's expression changed. I know. I thought you left because you stopped believing in me. Jessica slowly shook her head. I left because I stopped recognizing myself. Bruno went quiet. Jessica continued. I kept trying to fit into your life. Your schedule. Your world. Your expectations. She paused. And I forgot that I had a life too. Bruno lowered his eyes. I didn't see that. I know. The words were painful, but neither looked away. Bruno reached across the table. He didn't grab her hand. He simply placed his hand near hers. Jessica looked at it. Then she moved her hand closer. Their fingers touched. Neither pulled away. The restaurant's music faded into the background. Bruno took a breath. I can't change what happened. Jessica nodded. Neither can I. But I can change what I do next. Jessica looked directly into his eyes. And what are you going to do? Bruno hesitated. Then he smiled. Choose you without asking you to lose yourself. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She looked down, trying to hide them. Bruno gently laughed. You're still doing that. Doing what? Pretending you're not crying. Jessica laughed through her tears. And you're still terrible at pretending you're okay. Bruno smiled. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel painful. It felt safe. Then Jessica finally reached across the table and took his hand. Bruno looked down at their hands. His eyes became wet. After years of distance, neither of them needed a dramatic promise. They only needed that one small gesture. But Jessica wasn't finished. She leaned closer. There's one thing you still don't know. Bruno looked at her. What? Jessica squeezed his hand. The second note wasn't the last one. Bruno's smile disappeared. Jessica slowly reached into her bag. And this time, what she pulled out wasn't a letter. It was something that could change everything they thought they knew about why they had separated. Jessica slowly placed the small object on the table. It was a key. Bruno stared at it. Then he looked at her. What is that? Jessica smiled through the tears still resting in her eyes. Your old key. Bruno's expression changed immediately. Years earlier, when their relationship had still felt simple, Bruno had given Jessica a key to a small place they had dreamed about turning into their private escape. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a mansion. It was just a quiet space where they could disappear from the noise. They had talked about writing music there, cooking together, watching movies, having ordinary mornings. A life where nobody cared who Bruno Mars was. But after their relationship fell apart, Bruno assumed Jessica had returned the key. She never did. I thought you gave it back, he said. I tried. Why didn't you? Jessica looked down at it. Because I couldn't. Bruno leaned back slowly. Jessica continued. I went there once after we stopped talking. Bruno's eyes narrowed. You did? She nodded. I sat in that room for hours. She smiled sadly. And I realized something. What? I wasn't waiting for you. Bruno looked confused. I was trying to remember who I was before everything became complicated. That sentence stayed with him. Because Bruno understood it. He had spent years doing the same thing in a different way. On stage, he was confident. In front of thousands of people, he knew exactly what to do. But alone, he sometimes wondered whether the person everyone loved was the same person Jessica had once known. Jessica pushed the key toward him. You should have it. Bruno didn't touch it. Keep it. Jessica looked surprised. Why? Because I don't want us to go backward. He paused. I want us to build something different. Jessica's eyes filled again. Bruno reached across the table. This time, he took her hand. Not dramatically. Not for anyone watching. Just enough for her to feel that he was there. Jessica squeezed his hand. I was afraid you'd say that. Say what? That you wanted everything to go back to the way it was. Bruno shook his head. I don't want the old US. Jessica looked at him. Then what do you want? Bruno took a breath. I want the version of us that knows better. Jessica smiled. A small laugh escaped her. That sounds very Bruno. He laughed too. For a few seconds, the weight of the past disappeared. Then Bruno noticed something written on the back of the key tag. A date. He recognized it instantly. It was the day they had first talked about building that quiet life together. Bruno looked at Jessica. You kept this all these years? Yes. Why? Jessica's voice became softer. Because I wanted to believe that some things could survive time. Bruno looked down. A tear rolled down his cheek. Jessica gently wiped it away. No more pretending, she whispered. Bruno nodded. No more disappearing. They sat there holding hands. No cameras. No stage. No audience. Just two people finally allowing themselves to be honest. But neither of them noticed the little girl standing nearby. She had heard enough to understand that something important had happened. And when she asked Bruno one final question, he gave an answer that Jessica had been waiting years to hear. The little girl stood beside the table, looking from Bruno to Jessica. She seemed unsure whether she was allowed to speak again. Bruno noticed her and smiled. You have another question? She nodded. Did God bring you two back together? Bruno looked at Jessica. For a moment, neither answered. Jessica's eyes softened. Bruno looked down at their hands, still resting together on the table. Then he looked back at the girl. Maybe, he said. Jessica smiled. But I think we had to choose it too. The girl nodded as if the answer made perfect sense. Then she walked back to her family. Bruno and Jessica watched her leave. Neither spoke. The restaurant noise slowly returned around them. But something had changed. Jessica looked at the key on the table. Do you really want to go back there? Bruno shook his head. No. She looked surprised. Then why keep the key? Bruno smiled. Because maybe we don't need to go back. He paused. Maybe we can start again somewhere new. Jessica stared at him. That was the moment she understood. Bruno wasn't asking for the old relationship. He wasn't asking her to forget the years of silence. He wasn't asking her to pretend nothing had happened. He was offering something harder. A new beginning. One built on everything they had learned while apart. Jessica slowly nodded. But I have one condition. Bruno smiled. Of course you do. No disappearing. He nodded. No disappearing. No pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Agreed. And if you're scared... She stopped. Bruno finished the sentence. I tell you. Jessica smiled. Exactly. For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then Jessica leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. Bruno closed his eyes. Neither said anything. They didn't need to. The silence that had once separated them was finally becoming the silence that understood them. But there was still one thing Bruno hadn't asked. "What made you come tonight?" Jessica pulled back. She looked toward the window. Then at him. "I almost didn't." "Why?" "Because I thought seeing you would hurt." Bruno nodded. "Did it?" Jessica smiled through a tear. "Yes." Bruno looked down. "But not the way I expected." He looked back at her. "What changed?" Jessica touched the old photograph. "I realized I wasn't angry because you left." She paused. "I was angry because I thought you stopped caring." Bruno's eyes became wet again. "I never stopped. I know that now." The two sat quietly. Then Bruno picked up the phone that had caused the tension earlier. He looked at the message. The international commitment was still there. The schedule had not changed. His career had not suddenly become easier. But Bruno did something different. He didn't hide the problem. He showed Jessica everything. Every date. Every trip. Every commitment. They looked through it together. Jessica asked questions. Bruno answered. For the first time, his career wasn't something happening to their relationship. It was something they were discussing together. They didn't solve everything that night. They didn't make impossible promises. They didn't announce anything to the world. They simply made a decision. They would talk. They would stay honest. And they would give themselves another chance to know each other without the pressure of being who everyone expected them to be. Months later, in this fictional story, Bruno would still travel. Jessica would still have her own life. There would still be difficult days. There would still be misunderstandings. But this time, when Bruno felt overwhelmed, he didn't disappear. He called Jessica. And when Jessica needed space, she said so. They had finally learned something neither had understood years earlier. Love wasn't about never changing. It was about allowing two people to change without losing each other. One evening, Bruno returned from another long trip. Jessica was waiting for him. There was no crowd. No cameras. No stage. She simply stood at the door. Bruno smiled. Jessica smiled back. He opened his arms. She stepped into them. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Bruno whispered, "I missed this." Jessica answered, "So did I." He held her a little tighter. And somewhere between the silence, the old photograph, and the forgotten key, they had finally stopped asking whether they could return to what they once had. They had found a better question. Whether they could build something new. And that became the real ending of their story. Not a perfect ending. Not a fairy tale. Just two people who had once lost each other, found their way back to the same table, and finally understood that the most important thing they could give each other was not a promise that nothing would ever change. It was a promise that they would never disappear from each other's lives without a conversation again. The next morning, Bruno placed the old key in a small box. Jessica watched him. "Why are you keeping it?" Bruno smiled. "Because it's not a key to the past anymore." He closed the box. "It's a reminder that we get to choose what happens next." Jessica took his hand. And this time, neither of them let go.